Live and direct, live and I take no jive.
Legalize it.
Come on, how much can a koala bear? Koala bear, koala bear. Koala bear. Barry pulls a joint out of his pocket. Bill says, "Great, Barry, a reefer."
Hi, welcome back. It's another episode of the Karma Koala podcast. And in this episode, I should say, off to Canada to speak to Owen Smith, who has written a book, Legalizing Cannabis, Edibles in the Supreme Court of Canada. And as we all know, edibles and hemp for human consumption, all that sort of stuff is just hot topic in North America at the moment. And I noticed the topic is sort of beginning now. The illicit market, shall we say, is so huge in Europe. That's becoming part of the discussion in Europe and how to manage that, as well as it being a discussion in terms of not just for adult use, but how people ingest their medical cannabis. Originally it was all flower, but it seems to be becoming more and more edible. So I'm basically very interested in speak to Owen about, why he sort of got into this conversation and could write what looks like a fairly hefty tome on it. When he lifted it up, it looked like his arm was hurting a bit. Owen, thanks a lot for joining me on the Karma Koala. First up, are you a lawyer? Is that your background or an academic?
No, I'm not. I'm probably an activist.
Okay.
I'm an activist, although I'm just leaving after this talk to go to third year sociology at the university. Just starting up. I'm restarting my academic pursuits.
Is that what led you to talking about this then, sociology? Thinking about how cannabis in Canada affected society once it was legalized and then regulated in each of the provinces?
Well, I'd say it's mostly the United States that drew me in. The story of cannabis prohibition, books like Jack Herer's Emperor Wears No Clothes, and others. There's an author up here who does cannabis history. His name's Chris Bennett.
Mm-hmm.
He's published a number of books, and once I got my hands on those, I was quite inspired by learning about the untold history of cannabis.
Well, that's the whole thing. Well, it's told and then it's forgotten, and then it's told again and then it's forgotten again because nobody ever bothered to write it down. So again, that's one of the reasons. As soon as I saw what you had written, I was really interested to speak to you because so little of this stuff is documented in hard old-fashioned way of putting it in a book that then can sit in a national library and actually be referred to. What are the rules for anybody not aware with regard to production and consumption of edible cannabis or hemp products in Canada?
Well, when I started, there was it was very gray. There were court cases that determined they couldn't find out how much THC was in an edible product. And because a police officer couldn't determine how much THC is in a cookie, would have to, extract the butter and the flour, everything out, then people were getting off. A woman named Watermelon was given absolute discharge for distributing cannabis on the nude beach in Vancouver. And so that was prior to me getting involved. These days, we in Canada have, since my trial, legal processing and edibles, but there is a restriction on the potency, and that restriction that keeps the potency really low protects new consumers, but it doesn't serve medical patients. And so even though I won in the Supreme Court of Canada, new laws were introduced that continued the arbitrary approach of the government to this issue, the approach that puts their needs before patients. And so patients now, I serve about 9,000 people in this city who need higher dose edibles. and we make those and distribute them across the country. So it's still a battle, but we've been through a few good ones.
The definitions are defined at a federal level, and then do the provinces have any say whatsoever on the level of THC within a product?
The federal government sets those laws in the Cannabis Act and gives the provinces the right to manage cannabis in their province, including enforcement. And so here in BC, we have a group called the Community Safety Unit. The Community Safety Unit, their job is to shut down anybody who doesn't have a license. And because we continue to operate outside of the law, because the law doesn't accommodate medical patients, we've been raided 3 times by this group and been threatened with large fines. And they set up their own little system where they will raid you, and then they will fine you based on what they raid. And then if you'd like to have a hearing, they have their own little kangaroo court that you can go to, and then they will rule on whether or not they get to keep your money or your property and this sort of thing. We've told them that's unconstitutional, that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that I used in my case still applies in Canada to all of these operations of government. And since we've come back with our lawyer team, they've stopped raiding us. But they do continue to raid others, including First Nations. Here on Vancouver Island, and the Comox First Nation was raided twice last year. And they're operating outside of the rules as well, as they tell that they have not been consulted thoroughly on the implementation of the Cannabis Act, and they would like to operate with some degree of sovereignty. Many of the nations out here never gave up their control. They're unceded, and so they have a right to operate on their own lands. There have been court cases that determine that they can have economic sovereignty over things like fisheries or things that relate to their well-being and survival, and cannabis could fit right in there. And currently, it's in a gray area where the law
well, they love to keep cannabis as opaque as possible. So, as you say, they can then create kangaroo courts or bodies or committees that aren't really answerable to anything. Give us a little bit of background about your specific case, what they did, and what it forced you to do in terms of using the legal system to try and define how edibles and the strength of edibles are defined under Canadian law.
Well, I was arrested in 2009 working for the Victoria Cannabis Buyers Club, and I was charged with trafficking THC. And we challenged the wording of the language of the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, that it was arbitrary, that they had divided cannabis into many different parts so that they could charge people in this arbitrary fashion. My boss previously had been before the courts, and they had kind of switched around the definitions. They had cannabis resin, cannabis THC, cannabis CBD, and other forms that would just obfuscate the process. And we directly challenged that. All of the cannabinoids produced within the trichome of the plant exist external to the plant. They're like hairs, like droplets on the end of hairs. And it's unnecessary. What we said, it was unnecessary for the government to say that you cannot take those glandular trichomes off the plant. They said you have to keep it all in one. Like I mentioned earlier, that makes it easier for them to determine the grams allowance that a medical patient is allowed. Once it's been removed, it becomes much harder. And that was their argument, that it was going to be too difficult for police to be able to check on the limits that people had if they did make any extractions, even if that meant pouring a cup of tea. So you could have your tea bag with your cannabis in it in the teapot, and that would be legal because the police could come and lift the tea bag out and they could just dry it and weigh it. But once you pour it into the teacup, at that point, that cup of tea was illegal. So that's how thin the distinction was. We would also say the cheesecloth was as thin as a cheesecloth. So as soon as you pour butter or oil over cannabis in a cheesecloth and squeeze it out, what you have then to make products, edible topical products, would be illegal. But you could keep this redundant mass of plant matter, and that was then didn't serve any purpose. So we were really trying to clarify the botanical fact that cannabis produces resin external to the body of the plant, and that people, if they're given the plant itself, should be given all aspects of it.
Did you have to start in the lower courts and then go up through the court system to get to the federal? I mean, which courts did you go through? What was the process, and how long did it take you to do it?
We started in the BC Supreme Court. We had 4 weeks before a judge. Then once we had delivered our arguments, including scientific arguments from an expert that we brought in of the botany of science, we also had patients deliver their stories, and also my boss at the time, he delivered, gave all the information about our operations. Very transparent, nothing to hide. Once we had gone against the chief science officer for Health Canada, and essentially, I talk about it in the book. I go through the transcripts from that trial and detail all of the arguments in this book, so that if anybody is wanting to know all of the details, that's really what I focused on in writing this book, was making sure that all of the arguments from the government, the arguments against cannabis, and our scientific arguments are laid out clearly, because it does involve all of the prohibitionists.
Well, yeah, I think that's really important, because otherwise this information stays hidden within court documents, which are virtually unreadable to the lay person. So unless it's written down in the format that you've put it, people will just never be aware of the information, because only somebody like yourself who's involved in the case all the way through from A to Z is going to understand that process and what that language means.
Exactly. That felt like a really important thing to do, because we are a bit of a leader globally in cannabis reform. And there's no reason why many other countries, especially the UK or other Commonwealth countries, wouldn't see.
Australia is a perfect example. It needs to understand. I mean, and Australia is a really, because what they do is, even with that information laid out within your book, they will say, okay, it is another Commonwealth country under the same systems of law, but they still have to reinvent the wheel, so to speak, and therefore government loves that, because whether it be state or federal, because the processes take so long, they hope that people are going to give up after a 3 to 5 year period.
Yeah, but this is a really important issue, especially with sick patients and dealing with all of the very serious conditions that we dealt with, and also the issue of opiates and the mass prescribing of opiates that has led some of our patients into hallucinations and the loss of their lives entirely, losing their families, not being able to communicate, shutting down their bowels, all of these things which are really horrible to have to go through. Many of the people who come to us in Victoria at the Victoria Cannabis Buyers Club are coming off opiates. And we're right in downtown Victoria, so we're in the middle of the fentanyl crisis also. So we are dealing with people who have high needs for very high doses to get them to sleep and get them through the withdrawals that these opiates have them going through if they want to escape them. So it's a very serious work, and that should be emulated around the world, I believe. The case went on after we won in BC Supreme Court the judge wanted me to be seen independently by a jury. And so I would go and have what the first thing was a voir dire, so a trial within a trial. Then I would have my trial. But when it got to my trial, the government called no evidence, assuming that because we'd made our trial very public, that people had already heard the ruling of the judge, that they would rule against the government. And I think they would have anyway, because it's just such an easy argument once you lay it out. To allow elderly patients a cup of tea and some cookies seems very reasonable to most people. And so I was called no evidence. We went to the Court of Appeal. So 3 judges in Vancouver. There they discuss issues such as standing, whether a healthy person such as myself helping sick people had the right to claim medical defense on behalf of sick people. Because of this complication, there was a 2-to-1 ruling in my favor. The one dissenting judge in Canadian law creates an automatic right to the Supreme Court of Canada. So then they appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada, which we went in front of 9 judges in Ottawa. And that was quite a wonderful time. We had patients from across the country rent a bus and drive around to different towns picking up patients. And we filled the courthouse room and the 2 overflow rooms and surrounded the place with medical patients. There were people eating cookies in the courtroom, vaping, and basically treating it like a sports event. Anytime the judge would say something on our side, everyone was cheering. And calm down, guys. But it was like that when we were in the Supreme Court of Canada. The Supreme Court judges only really spoke in our favor. They shut down the government when they presented arguments that really strayed far from the scientific facts, the botany of the plant.
And just so I understand the timing, when it was in the Supreme Court, this was post legalization, not prior legalization, correct?
This is prior.
It's still prior. Okay.
So it was 2015 that our court case came in, and it was that year we had the election that Justin Trudeau won in a landslide. And Justin Trudeau launched the cannabis legalization as part of his platform right at the same time that we were going through the courts. So we were a national story. I was on national live TV, radio, and all of this. We had a conservative MP on a show called Power and Politics on CBC, which is our national broadcaster. And he was faced up against one of our interveners in the Supreme Court, one of our co-applicants, who was a woman named Mandy McKnight with a son named Liam, who had Dravet's syndrome, a young boy with seizures, up to 100 seizures a day. Using cannabis oil had reduced them down to 0 or 1 seizure a week, and was started to live a normal life. And this was on national TV. It was nothing I had never seen anything like this, where the news anchor was questioning the MP about this woman's position, and he was stunned. He couldn't do anything. He couldn't even believe he had to answer it, because you could tell he didn't agree. And the embarrassment that the Conservatives faced on this subject right before the election was a big bolster to that legalization push. It really put the issue of cannabis away from what the Conservatives were saying, people smoking on every corner. It's just going to be
the sky's going to fall in, essentially.
Car crashes everywhere. Yeah. This is their attack ads on the Liberals, often focused on cannabis. But at the same time, we were reframing it as a medical necessity for sick children, for the elderly, that it was cookies, it was capsules, it was massage oils, these things which take it away from that narrative, that prohibition narrative that keeps people a little bit afraid. And there's no reason to be afraid. Really, these diseases are much scarier than cannabis is.
The Supreme Court made its decision. Specifically, what was that decision, and did they make any definitions as to what cannabis was when it was combined with a edible or drinkable product?
Well, they struck the law down, no force and effect. It was a unanimous decision, and they gave the government no time to react. So immediately the law was struck down. All of the applications that were behind mine, that is anybody who was arrested and charged with a processing extract offense during my course of the trials, those were thrown out. Anybody at the time could make anything that they wanted until the government were to reintroduce laws, which took them about 2 months, and they brought in like an emergency law that restricted people to 3% potency, which was the arbitrary limit that I mentioned, that was then transferred over to the Cannabis Act. So any edible product has to be kept at a very weak.
And we're still at those levels. There's been no amendments to the legislation since.
No, it's still an issue. I think it should be a top issue for the industry because it opens up a lot more. There's a lot of people who start using cannabis, get into it a little bit, and then they find they need more. They'll need twice as much, 3 times as much, and it's too expensive. With all the packaging as well, it's very embarrassing to have so much packaging unnecessarily, and people tend to then drift back out to their neighbors, people on the street who is making the products that will suit their needs, and they're not too hard to make. There's another issue there. So it should be for the industry a big boost if we do have reform on the limits. Then they could bring in new products, expand their product lines, and serve people in a more permanent way, not just as an introduction to cannabis. Yeah, we need to move people away from smoking. That was always the thing too. Right now in the legal industry, we have infused pre-rolls, which have got massive doses in them. You've got extracts inside, and they can smoke those. You get a huge dose, but you can't do that with ease with an edible. And that's just backwards. People should be moving away from smoking. It's generally understood that we don't want people to smoke. And there's many options that could come in, different things which would make a lot of sense. Drinks or tablets, or soothing people's needs better than inhaling.
And do you feel, we're nigh on a decade since there's been legalization, what progress it's all very quiet about Canada these days because the business gets on doing the business of business. And as we both know, there's a huge export market for the private sector. And we don't hear much about the domestic sector in Canada, and especially what you're talking about in terms of medical needs for patients. So, for example, I'm totally unaware, can people get medical cannabis on insurance? Can they get it through the public health system? All those sorts of issues don't really seem to be a topic you hear much about outside Canada, and I follow this stuff every day.
The vets, Canadian veterans, can have their cannabis reimbursed, and it's a widely utilized program that I think there's a very large number behind how much money the government's paying for veterans, but it's not part of the wider public health system. It's not covered. In Canada, much of the health is covered. We pay into it, and that is how we generally treat the medicine here. So it's still an outlier for those seeking medical cannabis.
In terms of where Canada needs to start thinking, at the moment the private sector has been left to get on and make money, but really in terms of social needs, the government have just sort of just thought, well, just push that to the side until people get pissed off again.
Yeah, it's these social needs which people care about, these things which make them think about cannabis a little bit differently. And now we have a bit of a push, a conservative push, against cannabis again. Just seeing more of it going on, more of the arguments
Now, well,
reemerge.
you see that south of the border as well. I mean, there's a lot of talk. It's fine if you're making money, but as soon as you start talking about anything other than making money in cannabis, the war on drugs sort of thing starts to pop up its little head again, doesn't it?
In Canada, businesses are focusing on tax relief. They are currently taxed at extraordinary levels, and the government is bringing in a lot of tax money. These companies are focusing a little bit on their own interests, and I don't believe it's having the impact they want in terms of lobbying. If they don't get the people on their side, then the politicians don't care either. And so they need to my advice when I talk to industry associations and company leaders is to focus on the values that people tie to cannabis. Why is it good? And maybe step out a little bit against the regulators if possible and challenge it a little bit with this necessity that we have for making it healthier for people. So we just had I just read a report that cannabis is bringing in billions of dollars, and it's exceeded logging and dairy farming and this sort of thing. It's bringing in a lot of money, and we have a large, export industry going on.
You have a huge export industry, and Canadian companies are the leaders in buying up local European companies at the moment. They're really way ahead of everybody else.
Yeah, we have that regulatory experience now working in this environment. These companies, and I worked with Aurora for 3 years. They're large and lots of departments all working together. So I have and I have hope that we will be able to get regulatory change, and that would include making these businesses more sustainable. But lots have been closing down and struggling and competing with the unregulated market. That's continued here. And a lot of calls these days go to shutting down the unregulated market and the approach of prohibition to basically come in and raid. And we know that doesn't really work. Even when
you have to regulate the regulated market fairly, and then that other stuff starts falling away. And it's something I've said over the years as well, is you have an unregulated market for 60, 80 years, 100 years, and then you expect it all to go away in 5 years. I mean, that's just not reality, is it?
That's right. And I think if they did raise the limit on these products to allow these companies to make them some of what is being provided outside of that, which is often just high dose gummies, this sort of thing at low prices, that would also help the regulated industry.
Do high sort of THC products leak in from the north from the US market into Canada? Because I mean, they love producing crack cannabis. I mean, that doesn't happen at all.
No, not I'm aware of, especially these days with the border being so tightly guarded.
Yeah.
That it's not something I ever hear about. And here in Canada, I mean, we have a lot of space, a lot of islands, a lot of places that are remote, and people grow cannabis, and they've been doing it for decades, and they know how to keep it secret. Now, the networks are all well established. So unless the government is going to reform the rules to allow the legal companies to make what's being made outside the market,